Welcome, everyone. My name is Catherine Grebe. I am the incoming director of Virginia Seminary Center for Anglican Communion Studies beginning in July of 2021 and Mead Professor Emerita of Biblical Interpretation and New Testament. The Center for Anglican Communion Studies exists to resource practices of reconciliation, which is done through equipping international community, empowering intercultural leaders, and enriching Episcopal Anglican identity. In light of this year's theme, the Anglican Communion, a Movement for Justice, we are delighted to speak with former Ambassador John Casson and Bishop Graham Kings on the quite thorny but significant topic of faith in diplomacy. Mr. Casson has spent 20 years in government roles in the UK, including as David Cameron's foreign policy advisor and then as British ambassador to Egypt from 2014 to 2018. While in Egypt, he created a campaign, Empower Egypt, in which women, young people, people with disabilities, young entrepreneurs were promoted to an Egyptian audience and connected with British changemakers in their sectors. By tweeting about this work to more than 1 million Arabic-speaking followers, he communicated new possibilities for the way states relate to society. Ambassador Casson's latest role is that of UK leader of L'Arche, the Catholic-founded disability charity. L'Arche UK runs 10 communities that bring together adults with and without learning disabilities, and globally, the L'Arche movement runs 181 communities and projects in 38 countries. Former Ambassador Casson has a postgraduate diploma in theology and a BA in history, both from the University of Cambridge. Welcome, a warm welcome, Ambassador John Casson. Your contributions are inspiring, and it is a real honor to have you with us today. The Right Reverend Dr. Graham Kings, in his retirement in Cambridge, is Honorary Assistant Bishop in the Diocese of Ely and Research Associate at the Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide, which he founded in 1995. He has served as mission theologian in the Anglican Communion, Bishop of Sherborne, Vicar of St. Mary's Church, Islington, London, where he co-founded Fulcrum, a network of evangelical Anglicans seeking to renew the center of the evangelical tradition and the center of Anglicanism. He has also served as a lecturer in mission studies and as vice principal of St. Andrew's College, Kabare in Kenya. He studied at the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and Utrecht, has written for The Times and The Guardian, and is the author of books on theology of mission, Kenyan liturgies, and theology and art. His collected poems, Nourishing Connections, was published in 2020. A warm welcome to you, Bishop Kings. What a wealth of experience you bring. It's a pleasure to see you again and a real delight to have you with us today. Lastly, it is my honor to introduce today's moderator, Wanjiru Gitau. Wanjiru is a professor of practical theology and world Christianity at Palm Beach Atlantic University and is a CACS Fellow in International Ecumenism. She earned her PhD in world Christianity from Africa International University in Nairobi, Kenya. In 2019, Dr. Gitau won the Christianity Today Book of the Year Award in the Missions Global Church category for Megachurch Christianity Reconsidered, Millennials and Social Change in African Perspective. We really thank you for being here today, Dr. Wanjiru. Today's conversation is taking place as a webinar on Zoom and is also being broadcast live on YouTube and shared on Facebook. We will have almost an hour of conversation and we'll be weaving in questions from our audience throughout this time. We encourage participants to submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom or in the chat and comment sections on YouTube and Facebook. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but we will end today promptly at 1:45. And with that, I'm happy to welcome you all and to turn this conversation over to Dr. Wanjiru Gitau. Thank you.
Thank you. It is a joy and an honor to be able to moderate this conversation between these two auspicious gentlemen. We have so much to learn from them, from both of you. You have such publicly visible careers, ministries, uh, easy access around the world, well known, plenty of material about you or from you online, even books. And so I am sure that there'll be plenty of questions coming from our audience. And also we have some questions and a good conversation to get going here. I am particularly, delighted to know that Bishop Graham, you spend significant amount of time in my country, Kenya. Same with Ambassador John, as well as in Africa, and you are very interested in young people and emerging the questions, the emerging questions that they raise. And so let's get into it. I really want you to start by telling us about your own journeys of faith, because as I look online at your writings, recorded public material, one discerns this deep resonance with the life of the Spirit, which is embodied in the practice of reflexive listening, a dialogic imagination, and very easy access, across the board. Tell us more about yourselves, starting with you, Ambassador Carson.
Thank you very much, Wanjiru, and thank you to everyone for being here. It's great to have this conversation together. I've always been a person of faith, and actually for me, the faith story is a longer story and a deeper story than the professional story. I actually entered the world of diplomacy and the Foreign Service in my very late 20s, after quite a few years of wrestling with vocation and testing out vocations more in the world of mission or ordained ministry and theologically focused academia. And I got to know Bishop Graham during that time. He was my supervisor for a dissertation in Cambridge on African Christianity. And I entered diplomatic service in some confusion, having failed to find myself called by God to a specific profession or a specific occupation. Bishop Graham said something to me as I left Cambridge to enter diplomacy. There was a great consolation to me at the time. He said, you're still going to be doing mission as a diplomat, which I took to heart. And I tried to live into that, but it wasn't always clear to me exactly what that meant. In what way I was part of God's mission to the world while being a British diplomat pursuing British interests around the world. 20 years later, just before I quit finally, after 20 years of being a diplomat, I was on a retreat and praying, and I went back to those years in my 20s, which had been quite painful about vocation, and I said to God in prayer, where were you when I was ready to do anything for you and you didn't really show up? And I had one of the most sort of profound spiritual experiences of a stillness in myself, where I descended to kind of place beyond my thoughts, where I felt God said something back to me. And what I felt God say back to me was, I was there 20 years ago, but while you were rushing around looking for dragons to slay, I was planting trees, and you're one of the trees I've been growing, and I'm actually quite happy with the tree and its fruit. And that also was a great consolation to me. And I think I take two things for that about the relationship between my faith journey and my professional journey. One is that when you're on the path, it's winding and crooked, because the things you're focused on are part of a much bigger story, and you can't see the whole story until you look back with a different vantage point. But I had three compass bearings, if you like, that were sort of keeping me on the path. One was that I believed that God could be found in all things, and God was concerned for all things, including the world of politics, including the world of diplomacy. The second was that I always had an instinct to pray, that God wanted my attention in prayer. And the third was that I believed God was a God who crosses boundaries, and who leaves home to find something more liberating, more rich, and to find a deeper home. And that we're all called to that incarnation or crossing of boundaries, leaving of home, leaving of our core identity to discover something greater in the other. And that's obviously what diplomacy is about. It's living across those boundaries. But I also understood it in a theological sense and in a spiritual sense. And I think that's been a thread through all my faith life and my professional life, is that idea of leaving home to find a deeper home. We spend a lot of time when we read the Bible focusing on the prodigal son coming home. But actually, the Bible's full of narratives of people leaving home, whether it's Abraham or Jacob or the prodigal son at the beginning, and of course, Jesus. And I think it's very powerful to understand the gift that lies in transcending the certainties of our home base, our self, our view of the world. And we enlarge our sense of self and enlarge our sense of the world and our sense of what God is doing by crossing boundaries like that.
Wow, that's very profound. We'll come back to it in a minute as we hear your journey towards Latch. How about you, Bishop Graham?
I was very moved by what John's just said. And there's a lovely Filipino proverb which says, God writes straight with crooked lines. And that's that's what I felt, that God really is in charge. And yet he lets us go our way and nudges us back and things. I came to faith in Christ at Oxford and went up miles and miles away from God. I'd had a gap year in the army. I mean, I'd sung in the choir as a child, but I was miles from God. And the very first person I sat next to for a meal was a strong Christian. He got me reading the Gospels again. And the Jesus I met in the Gospels matched the Jesus that I saw in the lives of students. And there was a Bible study group, an IVF in American terms group. But he didn't push it. He wrote to me at Christmas. And then he said, do you want to come to chapel? Hertford College, Oxford, in January. This was the 20th of January, 1974. And I went, and it was a lovely service. But I went to a Christian Union meeting afterwards, and it was there that I heard the gospel preached, and that you could know God for yourself in giving yourself completely to God. And I prayed a prayer of commitment there, and everything changed. That was on the Sunday. I met my wife on the Wednesday. That's not a reason for praying a prayer of commitment like that, but I did. And then on the Friday, I joined a missionary prayer group for God's mission throughout the whole world. I was reading law at the time, and then changed to theology and did an extra year. Then I had a gap year at St All Souls Langham Place in London as a caretaker, as a janitor. Went to Cambridge for further study and ordination training and ministry in inner city London. And then trying to decide whether was God calling me to be an inner city vicar, rector, or to serve overseas. And it was on holiday, actually, with Ali, my wife. I went to evening prayer at the local church in Jersey in the Channel Islands. And there was the set reading was Genesis 12, Abraham setting out, not knowing where he's going, and that God would bless him in a country away from his kith and kin. And as a result of that, we joined CMS. We went to Kenya for 7 years. Then I thought I'd be a vicar when I came back, but actually this new lectureship in mission studies in Cambridge turned up, and went for that and did 9 years here, founded the centre. And then I really wanted to be a missionary again in the front line. And a lot of missiological and world Christianity scholar friends just couldn't believe that I gave it up to be a vicar in Islington. But I was a contextual theologian there in a new setting, and that buzzed lots of new ideas and writings and things. And then Bishop of Sherborne in rural Dorset, mission theologian in the Communion. And then at the end in London, I served in an inner city parish again and loved it. And now I'm really enjoying retirement. So it's been God writing straight with crooked lines. It's been very moving indeed.
That's a beautiful expression. Now we're going to come back to that, because you're many things. You're a theologian. You're an institutional builder. You are an author, and we want to hear more about that. Let's hear from Ambassador Carson, you were an ambassador in Egypt and the Middle East, and as an ambassador, one occupies some in-between geopolitical spaces, perhaps with a degree of liminal consciousness, a feeling of almost being in between the now and not yet of that we in Christian mission refer to as Missio Dei. But you're also very well engaged on social media in public conversations. Does this liminality have something to do with your interest in alternative methods of diplomatic engagement, paying attention to young people across the non-traditional ways of diplomatic engagement? And what lessons might veteran leaders, the older leaders, learn from that?
Thank you. Well, let me tell you a little bit about how the diplomatic approach that I took in Egypt developed, because of course things always look clearer looking back than they do as they're unfolding. And eventually I came to see it as offering a kind of transformation, or you could even say an incarnational type of diplomacy.
Yes.
In opposition to the traditional diplomacy, which is very status quo oriented, it's transactional, it's top down, it's quite short term. But I began being very transactional diplomat. I mean, I was sent to Egypt after the Arab Spring and after the crackdown at a bruising time to try to reset relationships
right.
to Britain, to the West and Egypt. And after 18 months, that mission was in flames because I ran into some very big obstacles. There was the big security incidents which caused us to suspend tourism between Britain and Egypt, which was a big economic blow to Egypt, and it caused a lot of hostility to me. And I discovered that Egyptians were born and bred on a deep sense that if the British ambassador is there as the colonial power, he was there, he was up to no good. He was almost certainly lying, and he was almost certainly wanting to take power away from Egyptians. And whatever I might think about my motives, I was a protagonist in a long, deep historical conflict between different interests. And I suppose so after 18 months sort of hitting this situation of quite a lot of hostility and people lying about me, people attacking me, I could have just kept going trying to pursue that transactional diplomacy. But two other things were going on in the background, which eventually gave me a way to leave the home base of one sort of diplomacy and move into another. One was that I was, because I've always had this instinct to love crossing cultural boundaries, I was just hanging out with Egyptians. I was going to the places where they were going. I was laughing at their jokes. I was speaking their language, learning their food and their football, enjoying myself originally. But it started to create a buzz. It started to create a sense that the British ambassador is interested in us. He doesn't just want to take power away from us. He wants to listen to us. He wants to come to where we're at and share power with us and partner with us. And I started discovering the most inspiring and transformational people in Egypt were positive change makers on the ground, not necessarily people inside the government institutions.
Right.
And I began to realize the real show, the real game here is the 25-year game of what will make this society more flourishing and more inclusive by bringing in all of the Egyptian people as the asset for the future of Egypt. And actually I needed to sort of engage with that generation that would decide that future over 25 years. And then the other thing that was going on was, as well as that process of modeling a different type of power, a different way for a government to relate to Egyptians, to Arabs, I was doing a lot of inner transformation as well, because the job was very exposed and challenging. People were lying about me on television every night, and what you don't transform, you transmit. So I was having to do a lot of inner work, praying to make sure I didn't transmit this stuff and didn't just become locked into these cycles of conflict and cheating and lying. And having always been a person of ideas and action, I became a person of contemplation as well, as a third leg on the stool. And it was a revelation. It was like going scuba diving and discovering this whole world beneath the surface to explore. And I began to become clearer that if I wanted to be part of the transformation of society, I had to transform myself too. And I suppose where you started the question about liminality is where this comes in, is that it's in the disorientation
Right.
of crossing boundaries, of leaving your sense of your secure self, your sense of your power, your sense of, you know, you're representing your country in the way that everyone wants you to, and going into a more disorientating arena that you find gift and you find transformation.
Right. And it's
That's
also
not
a space where it's no longer, you can no longer use hard power. You know, that, for instance, the British, you know, the power of the British Empire that would have been more strong and forceful at a particular moment in history. Now you have a very expressive young adult generation to speak to, not even just the political power, who are constantly on social media.
That's right. I don't like the word soft power and hard power, because soft power sounds weak. It's actually not weak, it's deeper and stronger and more transformational. So I prefer this contrast between transactional and transformational. But to be a transformer, you've got to be transformed. To be a reconciler, to reconcile through reconciliation, you've got to be a reconciler. So who you are becomes as important as what you're doing with your power.
That's profound. Bishop Graham, of necessity serving, you know, within the Anglican Church itself, talking about questions of leadership here, within the larger society, it presents quite a different challenge. You have to be the symbolic bearer of good public goodness, you know, sometimes public morality, and yet you cannot opine on social mores in the public media. You have to serve the poor and the marginalized at the call, you know, of the church, and yet you cannot claim standing for the church or even for the self. You have to be the reconciler, and yet there are places you cannot influence the laws that politicians make. Talk to us about walking that conciliatory pathway, that in-between path, and it's quite connected to occupying this liminal space where you've got to mediate different forces and influences and a plurality of ideas, and yet stand on very strong faith convictions.
Thank you, Wendy. That's a great question. But I begin with a snooker match with John Casson in Cairo. And we had a mission theology in the Anglican Communion first conference in Cairo, actually. And John invited me to there. And I said, I reckon you've got a snooker table here in your residence. And he said, yes, Churchill played snooker on it 3 weeks before El Alamein. So we actually had a church-state snooker match. Snooker is more like billiards, but more complicated. And I seem to remember, John, that Church won 56-34. At least it says it in my diary. So we've stayed in touch during the years. But to your point, it's important to be able to manage upwards as well as manage downwards. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important in leadership. I was a curate in St. Mark's Harlesden, inner city church, multicultural, and it was new to me. It was wonderful. There were Caribbean people, but people from West Africa, Gujarati Asians. Never crossed my mind to learn Gujarati, but if I'd gone now, I would have done. Just as it's really important that ministers in the Episcopal Church and other churches, if you're serving in a Spanish-speaking area, you just learn Spanish. So language is so important. And we had a black and white congregation, but our two church wardens were elderly white people. And I was looking around for leadership in the black community. We went to a wedding, and there was this man, Alec Wallen, who was an elder. He was an elder, and he summed up the whole community's words directed to the bride and groom. And I saw him as a church warden, and I talked to Terry, my vicar, and saying, look, we actually need a black church warden. And he said, yeah, we do, but I mean, where do you find one? I said, well, I've just been to this wedding, and Alec actually is an extraordinary leader. And Terry agreed and worked with it, and it came about, and it transformed the church. It transformed the feeling of being at home. And at the same time, I was working with Les Isaac, who was a Black evangelist in Harleston. He later founded Street Pastors and has had a huge effect on peace and reconciliation in inner cities. That was in the early 80s. And then in the Diocese of Mount Kenya East, from 85 to 91, I worked with Bishop David Gitari. And he was a bishop who stood out for justice and was very brave. He had an assassination attempt on his life. He survived. I saw him the day after. But he also was a reconciler. He was a very interesting mixture. And in terms of reconciling in church, there was the church was growing massively. The diocese was multiplying parishes. There was pressure from Embu to create a separate diocese, to split off. And he dealt with that very maturely. The cathedral was Embu, the diocesan office was in Embu, and he gave that up. So when it split into two, he took the half without the cathedral and without the diocesan offices. He had to build from scratch again. And I learned a lot from that. And then as a mission theologian in the Anglican Communion, the most complicated meeting was the primates meeting in January 2016. And I think many people remember that. It was the time when the Anglican Communion could have split. The newspapers were talking about that. And I wasn't in the meeting, but I had been involved in editing and writing briefing papers behind the scenes. And I remember Archbishop Justin played an extraordinary role of reconciliation. And it was a tough call. He said, right, we're at loggerheads. We go away and pray for 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a vote whether we're going to walk together or we're going to walk apart. And everybody went, I wasn't in the meeting, but he told me later. They went away and prayed, and they came to the vote, and they went all the way around, and all the primates were there, because he'd visited the 38, I think it was at that stage, primates in their own homes in 18 months, in his first 18 months. And they all unanimously voted to walk together. Now, they worked it out that some would walk at a distance, but that was a key particular moment.
I am keen to hear, Ambassador John, how did you come to learn the decision to learn Arabic? And what was the influence of being linguistically available to people in your diplomatic service? And what does that, in this era of multicultural, cross-cultural, intercultural engagement, what influence, does language have on, faith and leadership?
It's a lovely question. Thank you. I mean, I would put it in the context of the fact that we live in a globalized 21st century world where we're thrown together as human beings more than ever before in all our different cultures and societies. And one response to that, which we see everywhere, is to cling ever more tightly to your home identity, because it makes you feel safe, and it's legitimate. We are whether it's our family or our tribe or our nation or our institution, they're good things, and they create space for altruistic service of each other, but they also create problems at the boundaries. And now the boundaries are so in our faces on social media and every other way. A fundamental moral challenge of our age is to be able to encounter the other and actually to discover the gift in our home base. And of course, language is fundamental to that, and it was written in my childhood. All the members of my family are languages teachers. It was written in my theological formation. Bishop Graham and others taught me, about the fundamental translating dynamic at the heart of our faith in Jesus coming and speaking our mother tongue to us. And the way that, it's even built into the New Testament, which is already translated before it's written down from Aramaic into Greek, and how God's always crossing his boundaries to come to us. And speaking people's language opens up an ability to feel them, to get the jokes and to get the sort of subtext, but also it's a you know, even if you're not very good at it and you're learning as an adult and you're making mistakes, it's an expression of that desire to come towards them, to surrender your comfort, surrender your power, make yourself allow yourself to be a fool if necessary, to overturn that dynamic of us all hiding behind our boundaries in this modern world.
Yeah, and so speaking of language, Bishop Graham, you speak a different, you do speak Kikuyu, you do speak other languages, but also you also speak a different language of the spirit. And I want you to talk to us about the language of poetry and the language of liturgy and the language of art, because these are not new languages, and they're not, of course, literal languages, in the grammatical sense, and yet they enrich the life of faith and of leadership. And tell us more about your engagement in that, some of your poetry.
Thank you very much. For our retirement, we've got a house in Cambridge, and we built a small extension on it as a chapel. And so saying the daily office is a bedrock of spirituality for me. And although I use common worship in modern service publicly, I use the Book of Common Prayer, 1662, which was originally written in 1549, 1552, for my own private devotions. And I use the lectionary of the Cranmer's lectionary, which is huge chunks, every day. And I do feel that God speaks to me through those. And you say the Psalms, and the Psalms are poetry. When I was in Kenya, David Gitari asked me to be secretary of the Provincial Liturgical Commission. And it was during that time that the Kenyan Service of Holy Communion was written, and morning and evening prayer, and others. And it was very interesting being part of the group and drawing together people's insights into it. There's a lovely post-communion prayer written by John Nyesi, who was principal of Limuru at the time, that is so profound. And when somebody heard it, they said, that sounds like a prayer of a dying man. And actually he was dying. And then coming back, I was on the Church of England Liturgical Commission. And we wanted to simplify common worship daily prayer. And we came up with the phrase time to pray. And I've got it here. It's a little booklet called Time to Pray.
Time to Pray.
Yeah. And they wanted a title that if you saw it in a bookshop, you'd think, oh, I need that. Everybody needs time to pray. And it's now digitized, and it became incredibly popular during lockdown. It's a simplified form. So there's prayer during the day, and compline, night prayer, is this. So it's a simplified form. And then I worked with Silvia Dimitrova, a Bulgarian icon writer who also does iconic paintings. And you can see just above my shoulder here, the painting of Lydia. I'm preaching at chapel tomorrow, and I'm expounding some of that story. And we've done a project over 17 years of 7 women in the Bible. Ali and I had theological ideas. We discuss with her. She does a sketch. We discuss it, and then we don't see it until she produces it and brings it to a party at our house. I then write a poem on the painting, expounding the biblical text and the painting. And I've got a friend nearby in Cambridge who's a composer, Tristram Latchford, who has written 7 anthems on my 7 poems on the 7 paintings of the 7 biblical texts. So that's going to be performed at the world premiere later this year at the Royal Foundation of St. Catherine. But I find that people are open to God through poems, through literature, through art and music especially. And it's a way in.
Right. We live in an age of anxiety, deep anxiety, and those are really new, not new, but all resources that are so easily within reach, and cultivating the life of the spirit through art and poetry. is so enriching and might resource, even our leadership practices. All right, I want to move this conversation slightly further ahead and ask Ambassador Carson. Now you are no longer in diplomatic service. You've moved to Latch, UK. Those of us familiar with the Latch community know of Henry Nouwen, who moved from, Harvard and Yale, teaching in Harvard and Yale, and then wrote this profound material, depth of spirituality that he inspired a whole generation with. There are, of course, others, like John Vanier, who recently passed away, but also had some controversies around him. Tell us about your own journey from the diplomatic world and public service and political, geopolitical service to the world of Latch, and what that means for you both spiritually and also from a leadership perspective.
Thank you. Yeah. So for those who don't know the L'Arche model, it's about people with and without learning disabilities living together, living shared lives in community together for the mutual transformation of both, to reveal the gift of people with learning disabilities, but also for the formation and transformation of people without learning disabilities. It was a crooked road, a winding road for me to get there. The seeds were planted in Cairo by the attention I was talking about. I began to pay to interiority and to what's really transformational. But I think where I ended up was this, what I've been talking about, this interest in the gift and the transformation that's available for us as individuals and for society in relationships across difference. Mm-hmm. And L'Arche is about creating relationships, profound home across difference. And it's a way of being with those who are often excluded and discovering that there's a huge gift there and that there's a presence of the kingdom of Jesus there. But it's also a way of forming ourselves. Where we choose to put ourselves forms us and shapes us. And I think we often underestimate how profoundly we are being formed. It's not just a few people who are interested in formation. Formation is happening to everybody all the time. We're being formed psychologically by our human journey of building up our sense of security through our status, through the approval we get from others, through power, through financial security. We're being formed professionally in being told to be successful and to build institutions and acquire control. We're being formed socially and culturally. We've got a culture that tells us we are what we have, we are what people think of us, we are what we do, and a culture that distracts us and a culture that isolates us. And in a way, L'Arche is a space that tries to create an alternative and maybe take a stand against all of those things which can enslave us by the values of superiority and the values of self-sufficiency. And it's a place where we're asked to let go of that, and by being with the other, discover that's where the life of God is, and challenge our sense of false security, perhaps. So L'Arche, on that road of discovery, L'Arche met me, if you like, coming the other way. And it was that chance to be in a formational space that was a sign of a different set of values, to be with those who are excluded and to be formed myself in the process.
Mm-hmm. Within in the UK society, what are the dynamics of say disability and exclusion and marginality in that particular? What are the needs and what?
Well, we've just seen a very powerful example of it during COVID, during the pandemic, actually, and there is evidence emerging now that people with learning disabilities are much more likely to die if they catch COVID. And for so even if you take account of their other health conditions in their age, young people under 30, some estimates are 30 times more likely to die if they have a disability and a learning disability than they have COVID. And it's because there is a subtle marginalization and a discrimination built into even our healthcare systems. It's difficult when you go into hospital with a learning disability. You're distressed and disrupted from your normal routines that hold you, from the people that understand you and can help you communicate. You can't communicate your pain, you can't communicate your needs. It's difficult for you to be involved in decision-making about your care. All of these things add up to poor health outcomes. And I don't think no one means to be cruel, or very few people do. The health service is full of people wanting to do their best, but in a society that prizes being articulate,
Right.
Being self-sufficient, being clever, intellectually, cognitively clever, being successful, it's inevitable that people who have other types of gift, and as Christians we believe that those things, being superior and being self-sufficient, can actually be spiritual disabilities, and that Jesus is with those, the kingdom is with those who perhaps aren't characterized by that, but society subtly marginalizes people with learning disabilities.
That's so profound, and I want to push you, because you have been an ambassador, which means you have, served within the British, the context of British politics, especially in a time of serious questions, deep questions, relating to Brexit, relating to Britain's relationship to the rest of the world. With all due respect to people who serve in charitable work and in the social kind of work, why not stay in political service? There are very few men, I would imagine, of faith and deep conviction, and yet of the sort of capable leadership that you exercised when you were in diplomatic service. And this question is relevant to people who would ask, should Christians aspire to high political office kind of leadership? Why not stay with that track? Why not even vie to be a member of parliament and maybe have a great cause like William Wilberforce and transform things from the political center rather than from the social service center?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think we have to examine what underlies a question like that, which is, why should we assume that there's something more powerful and more transformational by being in politics? I wouldn't say that my particular journey is something that everybody should take as a template, but I think we all need to pay attention to the power we hold and how we're using it. And it's not so much do we have power or not, because we have power wherever we are. I have power in the life I'm living now, just as I had power in the world of politics. Is it being used transformationally? Is it being used for my liberation, my journey towards God? So yes, absolutely, I want there to be people of faith in the world of politics. But I would say that political power is a provisional, not an ultimate good in terms of expressing the kingdom and God's redemption and reconciliation of all things. And political power carries dangers. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said, almost anybody can cope with suffering, but give a man power and you'll really test his character. I think it just needs attentiveness for any individual. The question is not, it's always right to be in politics or it's always right to be in charitable endeavors, but these things hold together in the life of a living God, the living life in our living lives of a living God. And our role is to try to live lives of dependence and attention to God day by day, so that we can discern where for us in this moment, here and now, the life of God is leading us. That's why we're called to a life of relational wisdom, not sort of ideological or theoretical morality. This is right and this is wrong. We're called to a life of trust, and trust that even in what might look like failure, God is working out his purposes. And so we all live a cycle, I think, of being given things to take hold of, but then when we start to grip them too tightly, being asked to let them go so that we can keep growing towards God and be part of his life in the world. And I've come to see my vocation as being a bit like the layers of an onion. And on the outside are things I might do for an occupation. I could be a charity chief executive, or I could be an ambassador. Those things don't really matter. At the core of my onion, the core of my vocation is living in daily dependence on the life of God and holding space for other people to encounter that too. And in a way, wherever you put me, it doesn't matter if I'm able to attend to that with God, and then I trust the rest to him.
Wow, amen. Couldn't top that. I want to shift this question, and I want to ask the audience to post their questions to the ambassador and to Bishop in the chat question. So I'm gonna ask this question to Bishop Graham in a slightly different way as well. The common thing, especially for those of us in the younger generation, is when we have the charismatic gift of leadership, you know, and a sense of call, we go and start something independent. We run and start our own institution, we start our own movement, organization, something like that. I want you to talk to us about leading within the institutional system and within the structures as a bishop, within the serving under others, serving with others. What would you say to a gifted young person who is listening here today and is wondering where their leadership skills are best exercised, especially in light of the multiple options of both tradition but also charisma?
I think I'd begin with God and what is God like? What's the sort of God we see in the scriptures? And a theme that I've spotted, which isn't that obvious, is that God is a getting out of the way sort of God. God does something and then he gets out of the way to let the people continue. So in creation itself, God creates, and then he passes that on in the story to Adam and Eve. And in Jesus' own ministry, there's the extraordinary 3 years and death and resurrection. But then what is the ascension? The ascension actually is the homecoming of the missionary son. It's the prodigal son coming home, going back to what John was saying earlier. But it is also Jesus getting out of the way and leaving it to his disciples through the power of the Holy Spirit to share the good news. Now, the God who gets out of the way isn't absent. He is present in new ways. So in Genesis, he is still there. And Jesus is still with his disciples in the power of the Holy Spirit. So what I'm saying is that if you found something, and I've really enjoyed founding various things, it's important also to get out of the way at the right time, to let somebody else take it over. And that's a key thing. Julia Middleton has founded Common Purpose, and a key theme in her work is leading beyond authority. She's written a book, Beyond Authority, Leadership in a Changing World, 2007. And somebody who also modeled this was John Stott himself. When I was a janitor at All Souls Langham Place, he was the rector emeritus, he was still on the staff. And he founded many things, but he also handed them over. Something that's not that so well known about Stott is what he learned from outside of evangelicalism. So he learned from the World Council of Churches at Uppsala the significance of social involvement. He learned from third world evangelicals, René Padilla, Sam Escobar especially, about the importance of social political action within mission, and that was in the Lausanne Covenant. But also he learned from Rome, and not many people realize this. From 77 to 84, he co-chaired what's called the Evangelical Roman Catholic Dialogue on Mission. And it hit the front page of Time magazine in 84. Just have a look at it. Google Erkdom, ERCDOM. And I gave a lecture in a Pontifical University of Baniana in Rome on it. It's on the website. So he was somebody who could learn from outside. And what John is saying is you always learn from the other. You're incarnated and you learn from the other.
All right. Now let me see. Do we have questions from our participants? If you could post your question on the for these two gentlemen on the chat.
Wanjiro, I could add a word to what Graham's just said while people are thinking about that. If going back to your idea of a young person facing, where do I place myself? Where do I make my impact? I would really point to the idea of abundance and God's abundance. I think I've given myself a hard time, and my story about my 20s shows this, by thinking basically there's a scarcity of good lives for me to lead, and I've got to find it. If I miss it, I'm in deep trouble. And I've all my life been haunted by the parable of the talents and the idea that God is a sort of angry king who'll tell me off for wasting my one shot. Because of that, I've wrestled with that parable an awful lot. And I've come to realize that the angry king is really in the mind of the servant who says, I thought you were a master who reaps where you do not sow, and therefore I'm going to hoard this little thing you've given me and bury it in the ground and protect it from loss. Instead of living open-handedly and realizing that scattered all around us every moment are infinite invitations from God. And God is delighted if we pick up any one of them, and we'll work with that and turn our little tinkling on the piano into a beautiful concerto by playing with us. So I would say, we're under huge pressure in our culture to project ourselves and construct ourselves into a being of meaning amongst all the myriad opportunities and identities that a postmodern liberal individual is supposed to have. And it's very stressful. And I wish earlier on in my life I'd been able to take deep hold of this idea that this world is abundantly full of God's invitations and God's opportunities. And whichever way we go, if we have the eyes to see, we will encounter God's abundant goodness cascading down upon us very generously.
Yeah. Wow. Profound. What's his name? I do defer quite a bit to Henry now. No, when his literature, his writings influenced me quite a bit at a significant moment of my own spiritual formation, journey of spiritual formation. And I'll ask this question in a minute, but he talked about the temptations of Christians leadership is temptation to be spectacular, temptation to be the temptation to be powerful. The three temptations that the devil poses at Jesus, I think they come at us at every single time in our life, especially when we find ourselves in public limelight.
That's right. Yeah.
All right, there's a question here for Ambassador John. In what ways does diplomacy encourage faith, and in what ways does it hinder faith?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the hindering. It's a world in which you are required to sort of leave your personal beliefs behind at the door so that you can be very neutral in encountering the other, and politically neutral as a civil servant, and neutral as somebody coming from a very different perspective. It's a cynical world that's all about things are just it's a cynical game, and just play it the way it is and don't expect to change it. And generally speaking, it's illiterate. Diplomats are religiously illiterate, and they see religion as a bit of a problem that's causing conflict, but they don't understand that it's a deep map by which people are navigating meaning in the world. And so all those ways hinder, but there are also reasons why it's necessary. I think it's personally demanding in terms of character, identity, and purpose to deal with people who are at odds with you and different from you, and that requires interiority and faith is the richest resource we have for that kind of personal life. And the imagination of how do we live together in a world where we owe deep moral allegiance to our own, and we also want to find universal love and cohabitation with the other. Again, faith offers, there's a poverty of diplomatic imagination about that now. And I think the world of faith offers resources for that we need to access.
All right. How do you embody grace? This is from Adam Lees. In context, I really think of politics since I have worked in it as well. So how do you embody grace in contexts that feels so graceless? That's a really good question there. How do you embody grace in contexts that feel so graceless, especially in today's world?
I think you already answered it, Wanjiru. I mean, so I worked in the Prime Minister's office, which is a bit like the West Wing in the US. It's a hardball political environment where it's a court around a king and everybody's struggling for face time and influence. And about halfway through, having desperately tried to establish myself at the court, I realized that actually everybody was feeling scared and like an outsider. And if I loved them and tried to ally with them and help them and see them and their interests as well as my own, actually they would ally with me and it would give me a lot more power and grace to do things. And then, as you said, when your attention to those things that so quickly enslave us, caring about what people think of us, our security, what we have, and wanting to be spectacular. The temptations of Jesus take us there, and liberating our soul to live openly and generously to a bigger life around us is a daily task of attentiveness and presence, and that's where the grace is.
Amen. That is a daily task of attentiveness. That is powerful. Bishop Kings, can you speak more about the relationship for you between poetry and mission? I really think we need to hear more about your heart for poetry, and I also like art, because you're such a patron of the arts. I was so taken up to find that. So this is a question from an anonymous person, but it's the relation.
I remember a doctrine lesson at St Andrew's College, Kabare, when I was trying to explain Christology of how Jesus was not half God and half human, but actually fully God and fully human. And I suddenly hit on the idea of a song, and that a song is made up of words and music. And the words can be Jesus's full divinity, and the music can be his full humanity. And when they come together in a song, then it is utterly extraordinary. And I wrote this poem. I mean, the easiest thing to explain a poem is I can just read it very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
In the beginning were the words, and the words were the poets and were part of him, lively and brilliant. And the words became music and were sung, full of beauty and freedom. We have heard the song and been utterly moved again and again. We had read poetry before, but beauty and freedom came through this song. No one has ever seen the poet. This one song, which is in his heart, has shown him to us.
Amen. I think there's a running theme right through in some of this conversation, the language of the heart, the language of intentionality, cultivating and accessing those depths is what really resources the public face we put out there as leaders. Okay, I think I have space for just one more question here. To work in reconciliation, you have to be reconciled yourself. How do you work toward reconciliation in systems of oppression that do not see themselves as oppressors? That's our last question for today. And so both of you might take a stab at it.
Shall I go first?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I recognize the context that's being described, I have to say, and it is really challenging. I guess I would say two things that I have tried to do. I don't think it's the whole story, but one is it's important to understand that we ourselves are participants, protagonists in the conflict, and we ourselves are holders of power that is oppressive for some. So we need to get beyond the idea that we're the good guys or we're the neutral guys, and there are these conflict people that need to be sorted out. Yeah. And we need to therefore work hard to show hospitality, to put ourselves in the shoes of the other and listen to the other and understand the other's position, even if we can't join it. And the other thing is to try to separate out our personal animus, our personal dynamic of how our ego gets caught up in conflict from the underlying issues. So in Egypt, I tried to be passionate and sometimes angry about justice and injustice. But I tried not to let that cloud my relationships, even with the people that were representatives of the state that was doing things that I didn't like. Because once you do that, A, you're not able to perform any function as a reconciler or diplomat, and B, you lose all perspective. Your animus and emotion of ego in your psyche takes over, and you are controlled by it. You're not free of it. And that takes a lot of inner work. As I said, what you don't transform, you transmit. There were people that I was in real difficult conflict with, and I spent a lot of time praying, how do I get freedom from the desire to take revenge, the desire to compete with this person, and be able to free my relationship to be a reconciler.
Wow. Bishop Graham.
Well, I've learned a lot from Muturaj Swami, who's the director of the Cambridge Centre for Christianity Worldwide. And he wrote this amazing book, Reconciliation, the Archbishop's Lent book, in 2016. And what I take from that is it takes the whole world to understand the whole gospel. And also that Christ is our address. We are actually in Christ. It's an extraordinary concept. I think our fundamental address in the universe is in Christ. We are nomadic, we can move around, but our locational address is in Christ. And once that is rooted there, and once we see that it takes the whole world to understand the whole gospel, then we are free to take risks.
Amen. I feel like we're just beginning. Like the conversation is just getting interesting. So I hope we can do this another time. But I'll hand over back to Anna, or if you might unmute yourself and come back onto the screen. And I thank you for engaging in this conversation. And I trust that our audience, our participants have been blessed by the discussion. Dr. Grip.
Thank you so much. I want to thank our three amazing guests for such an informative conversation. You took us to some very deep places of the spirit and of the heart today. We are wiser for having heard you talk among yourselves. Thanks for the great questions and for really very thoughtful, perceptive answers today. If you only caught the end or missed any of our conversation, you will find a full recording of the webinar on Virginia Theological Seminary's YouTube page. And before we close, let me just remind you that the next Center for Anglican Communion Studies event will be an online event, April 20th at 12:45, entitled Green Anglicanism, Understanding Ecological Justice Theologically. The forum will feature Bishop Paul Sarkar, former moderator of the Church of Bangladesh, and the Reverend Dr. Rachel Mash of Green Anglicans and provincial coordinator of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. So please tune in again then for what should shape up to be another timely and enlivening conversation. But for today, thank you very much, all of our panelists. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Thanks for your good questions. And go in